It was a genuinely loutish performance. It was rude. It was patronizing. It was inappropriate. I mean, talk about meddling in other people's politics. And and
Or how
that,
about just reading the room?
yeah, I think that part is entirely genuine. I really do think Vance is a lout.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, the co-host of Shield of the Republic. I'm a Bulwark contributor and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined in my partner in all things strategy, Eliot Cohen, who's professor emeritus at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and also a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, welcome on President's Day.
Yeah, we don't make a big deal of that, and we should. I mean, George Washington and particularly Abraham Lincoln. I don't know about you. I occasionally think about the Lyceum speech in 1838.
I think about it a lot, actually.
Where he says, "Look, there's no transatlantic military giant that can conquer us. If we destroy ourselves, it's going to be from within." And
I know I think about that speech a lot, and obviously in the last 2 months I've thought about it quite a bit. It is a speech that, and Bill Kristol quotes it all the time. It's a speech that's well worth revisiting. I was driving home from our place on the Eastern Shore today, and I was listening to a story about on President's Day about polling about who the greatest presidents are, and then also polls of political scientists and historians. And I just, for no particular reason, I just would say that the gap between the rankings of academic specialists and the public at large is greatest for the current incumbent of any of them.
Yeah,
surprise.
I believe that. Although there have been very interesting shifts over time. For a long time, Wilson was always considered one of the top 10 presidents.
Right.
And the academic, not that the academics woke up to the fact that he really was a bigot, which he was. They've overcorrected because he was a bigot and a racist. But he also, there were a lot of other things he did which made him extremely consequential, not always for the best, sometimes for the best. And so there's that as well. Well, it's been a very busy news week because of the Munich Security Conference. I think we should explain to our listeners that a little bit of the history of the Munich Security Conference. So this used to be called Wehrkunde, which means military stuff. It was created by Ewald von Kleist, who had been a junior officer in the Wehrmacht, was involved in the conspiracy against Hitler. And it was really intended as a transatlantic gathering. It started quite small. Everybody could fit into one hotel.
It was in the early 60s that he started this, I believe.
And it's now gargantuan. You and I went to it a number of times. I think in government I went once, but I know for sure a number of times I went along with a congressional delegation led by John McCain, who was always at his inspiring best there. Occasionally, some of the times it's just boring, and occasionally there are moments of high drama. And for sure, this was one of them.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in terms of its impact, and I'm not alone in saying this, I did say this yesterday in a Sunday Bulwark podcast I did with Bill Kristol, but our colleague Richard Fontaine, who accompanied us on many of those trips to Munich and was there again, made the same observation, which is the affect of Vice President Vance's speech at Munich probably hasn't been matched by any since Vladimir Putin's in January of 2007, and I think that's right. Unfortunately,
yeah, I agree with that. I think just a little bit of context here is, I think one of the things that struck me is that the Trump administration, while very far from being a smoothly running machine, was able to coordinate sending out a whole bunch of its senior people at the same time. Secretary of Defense Hegseth to the Ukraine defense group of about 50 nations that are supporting Ukraine. Vance to the Munich Security Conference. And then they also have the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State out there. So it was a full court press. I think the two speeches that got attention, the first one, the Hegseth speech, was not at Munich, but it got a lot of attention because it was quite brusque. It was, he walked back parts of it where he said, well, Ukraine's not going to join NATO. And basically ceasefire along current lines. It's very striking that Senator Wicker, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, said that was a damn fool thing to say. And he kind of walked it back. But then we had the Vance speech. And I think that I've been talking to some people who were there, and they said it was like an earthquake for the Europeans. So I've got some thoughts about it. I'd be curious to hear yours first, though.
So on the first point you made about the Trump administration, orchestrating a large group of folks, I mean, you did not mention, but could have, the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent,
going to Kyiv,
going to Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine Special Envoy Keith Kellogg, being both in Europe before and at the Munich Security Conference. But I don't think actually all this activity and noise indicates a very well organized, coordinated policy. I mean, Kellogg, first of all, was allegedly consulting with allies in order to put together options for the president. But while he was there, the president had a phone call with Putin. I have it on pretty good authority. Kellogg didn't know that was coming. And then announced that he was going to send a negotiating team out to meet with the Russians, which didn't include Kellogg. You mentioned already Hegseth's comments, which he then walked back. There also was a Vance interview in the Wall Street Journal that was at odds with what Hegseth said. I mean, it said that if the Russians didn't play ball and negotiate, there might be sanctions forthcoming. There might even be U.S. troops sent to Ukraine. It was, pretty forward-leaning, I would say, in terms of being tough on Russia. And I think one reason why the speech in Munich was so shocking is people anticipated that that's what Vance was going to talk about, what the administration's approach to dealing with the war in Ukraine was, given the fact that the president had, on Thursday had this bombshell about his phone call with Putin and his readiness to negotiate directly with Putin and meet with Putin, probably in Saudi Arabia. And then you had, a Rubio-Lavrov phone call that sets the stage for tomorrow's meeting in Saudi Arabia between Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov, former Russian ambassador to the United States, who's been a counselor, foreign policy, national security advisor to Putin for many years. Both very experienced diplomats meeting with Rubio and Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, and Steve Witkoff, who had been the Middle East negotiator and purportedly was going to deal with the Iran nuclear issue, but also happened to have been in Moscow picking up Mark Fogel, this American teacher who'd been held, for having been caught with medical marijuana in his suitcase, even though he had a valid prescription for it in the United States. And Moscow was held for a number of years. They just grabbed up another person, but have released them, as a kind of sweetener for the meetings tomorrow. Here's a pro tip to all our, listeners and viewers. If you're going to Moscow and you have, medical cannabis, don't take it with you because they will.
I think the better tip is don't go to Moscow.
Well, probably well taken. My point is, though, that none of this appears to have been very well coordinated, and we're dealing, I think, with policy by, sort of executive whim. And one of the things that's particularly notable, which I mentioned on the Bulwark on Sunday with Bill yesterday, is the Russian Foreign Ministry readout, which has now been translated into English, of the Rubio-Lavrov phone call, gives some indication at least of where the Russians are coming from. They said that the two sides discussed the unilateral obstacles created by the previous American administration, i.e. the Biden administration, to beneficial mutual relations between the United States and Russia, and that the discussion was not just about peace in Ukraine, but about normalizing relations between the United States and Russia, including removing the sanctions, not just the sanctions that were imposed after February 22nd, but sanctions that had been imposed earlier, including limits on the two embassies, going back to the 2016 Russian intervention in the U.S. election. So, it sets the table, I think, for potentially, a from my point of view, a not very satisfactory meeting between Rubio and Lavrov, and it's a kind of unequal footing that they're on, I would say.
So I mean, no argument. I just, I have a very low bar when I think about this administration. This was coordinated by their standards, just getting these guys up in the air and moving. We'll talk about the discussions in Saudi Arabia in a moment. I wanted to revert to the Vance speech. So for those of our listeners who didn't read it about it or listen to it, it really didn't talk about Ukraine at all. It was all about, here are the terrible things about Europe. Here's how the elites have failed the masses, and so on. And the thoughts that I had about it were,
just if I could, just to back up for 1 second, the basic premise of the speech was, I'm here at a security conference in the center of Europe to talk about threats to European security, but the biggest threat's not Russia or China. Right. It's an internal threat.
It's internal. It's immigration. It's illiberalism in terms of suppressing free speech. And then I mean, worse, he meets with the head of the Alternative for Deutschland, so this right-wing party. So I had, and it was awful. And it had a tremendous effect on the people in the room, I know. So my reaction to it were the three things. First, he was performing for an audience of one, and that audience was not in the room. And I think this is going to be a characteristic of the entire administration, that these guys will always be performing for an audience of one, obsessively watching TV in the White House. Secondly, it was a genuinely loutish performance. It was rude. It was patronizing. It was inappropriate. I mean, talk about meddling in other people's politics.
Or how about just reading the room?
Yeah, I think that part is entirely genuine. I really do think Vance is a lout. If you look at the way he responds to criticism, if you look at the way he engages in debate when somebody pushes back, he's a nasty, boorish guy, and that comes out, and which means he will never be an effective diplomat, because you cannot be an effective diplomat while being discourteous. You can say very hard things, and we had that wonderful conversation with John Sullivan, who I think was a very effective diplomat, who said very hard things to the Russians, but didn't do it by this way. But I think the third thing is that the Vance speech, as to some extent the Hegseth speech, it reflects old American attitudes towards Europe. And like you, I think I often wonder about how much of our moment is because of the particular circumstances of Trump and who he is and his not entirely accidental presidency, and how much of this is deeper forces. And that's, for me, that's one of the kind of abiding intellectual interests of all this. And unfortunately, I think in this case, what's happening is Vance taps into some very authentically old, discreditable, inappropriate, unfortunate, but very deep-seated American views about Europe. This is the home of authoritarianism or sort of hostility to freedom. These people are a bunch of free riders. We are very different from all of them. They took our money. I mean, this is all stuff that's familiar to us from the 20s and 30s. And I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to tell it to them straight. There's a great quote from Henry Adams, from The Education of Henry Adams, where he says, the American mind irritates the European mind the way a buzzsaw irritates a pine forest. There's an element of that too. And that's actually, in some ways, I find more worrisome, because I tend to believe that 4 years from now, these guys are out. But what's happened is these attitudes have resurfaced. They were possibly bound to resurface after the generation that had, was a living connection to World War II and the immediate post-war period has disappeared. By the way, echoes of the Lyceum speech, because Lincoln's Lyceum speech is the generation of the revolution has now all died off.
Right.
And how do we? And they knew what it meant to struggle for freedom. We don't.
Right.
And he took it from there. Well, there's something similar, I think, about the generation, our parents' generation that knew the war, that knew the early Cold War, that knew who Stalin was. And so I mean, that for me is actually one of the most troubling parts of all this.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about the Lyceum speech is Lincoln was responding to essentially acts of lawlessness,
Yes.
lynchings of, abolitionist editors. And it's reminiscent of the sort of electronic lynch mobs that Elon Musk, for one, is rounding up,
Which he does.
against
Which he does. I mean, there have now
against
been a
his
number of
critics, and
stories.
which Vance does against
Yeah.
his critics. Yeah.
Yeah.
You look, I don't disagree with what you've said. I mean, I would say kind of two things to what your analysis of his speech. One is, I agree it was intended for an audience of one, or at least a MAGA audience, not a European Security Conference. But in some sense, that's irrelevant, because what matters is what you described, which is the impact, and it's had a deeply discomforting impact on our allies in Europe. We could talk about the meeting that they held in Paris today, and which is one of the outcomes of all this. This was the emergency summit called by Macron, essentially on the grounds that, between what Hegseth said and what Vance said, the Americans are telling us they're not going to be here for us anymore. And we should talk a little bit about what the both short-term and long-term consequences of that are. But the other thing I would say is, you're right that Vance is, articulating essentially a view of Europe that was the pre-1941 pretty much American consensus. As I might have said in an earlier, phase of my career, it's not an accident, comrade, that he represents the, state of Ohio, which was represented by Robert Taft and John W. Bricker, in that period, two, outstanding isolationists. I mean, it's the view of Europe that we discussed a couple of weeks ago with Bill Brands, in his book about Lindbergh. Lindbergh had all of the same views about the corruption of the Europeans. What worries me is, what does this portend for, in the short term, Ukraine and European security? Coterminous with this, Scott Bessent was in Ukraine proposing what can only be described as an absolutely predatory version of what had originally been proposed by Zelensky and promoted by people like Lindsey Graham and Jack Keane and Mark Thiessen as a way to aid Ukraine more in the future. But, this idea was provided to Trump. It got into his head. But the way it's come out is we want you to sign away, 50% of all your future, energy, mineral wealth to us in perpetuity as payback for the 300 million we've given you, which is the wrong number because it's more like about 175 billion that we've provided them. And that I think is extremely worrisome because it suggests to me that we may be on the cusp. That, along with the backgrounding that you see American diplomats and Russian diplomats doing, that we want to get this done by Easter, which would be April 20th, which, by the way, Orthodox Easter and Easter in the West, for one of those rare moments because of the difference between the Gregorian and Julian calendars, actually comes on the same day. It's April 20th this year. That is, essentially 2 months away. And it's inconceivable to me that we could get a deal by then that would not amount to a sellout of Ukraine. It's inconceivable. And it's all being done so that Putin can have Trump come to Moscow and normalize Putin at the VE Day parade on May 9th in Moscow, which, as you will recall, Trump wanted to go to in 2020 and was barely talked out of it and sent Robert O'Brien as national security advisor instead.
Yeah, so that may happen, and I wouldn't exclude it. As always with things Trump, I'm going to wait and see what actually happens because there were the opposite signals, as you mentioned in the Vance thing. He also, I think, part of Trump's negotiating tactic is, he'll lay on the flattery and then he'll threaten, and so it may well be that way. But I think we don't know. I mean, my position throughout all this has been, by and large, that we just don't know. But look, for sure, it's awful and it's reprehensible. I think the European reaction is interesting. The one thing that I do think, and I wrote a piece about the Hegseth speech saying about what I thought was terrible and what I thought was within a certain norm, and I ended the article with a quote from your old boss, Bob Gates. And you know what? You read it today, you go, okay, so these guys have bad manners, much worse manners than Bob Gates for sure. But this is a message that has been consistently delivered by American leaders now for decades, and shame on the Europeans for not processing it. So that's one thought. Second thought, though, is some of the European states are just hopeless, but not all. And I think what you're seeing now is that there's some European states, the Nordic states, the Baltic states, Poland, Britain, although Britain is limited because of the situation it's in, some on the right day, the French, in a small way, the Italians, who are beginning to take it seriously. And, that's reflected in defense budgets. Now, the problem is that they need a kind of a step function increase to match this. And even then, but it's not clear to me, by the way, the Ukrainians would go along with this. And the Europeans are clearly furious about being excluded from any of the negotiations. Ukrainians are furious, as they should be, both should be. And so, Trump may do that and then just, get the middle finger from the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And, what the Europeans do have is they have the financial resources to help the Ukrainians, like, buy stuff from the South Koreans.
Right. Or us, if the United States.
Or us, which I don't think Trump would care about.
Yeah. So, first, I think, I agree with you about Bob Gates's 2011 speech, and he did it before. He did it when I was working for him, telling the Europeans they needed to step up. But, look, let's be a little bit fair here. I mean, today, 23 out of the 32 countries are spending 2%, or above of their, GDP. The president said they got to spend 5%. And Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, has been trying more realistically to get them all up to something like 3%. But, the president at the same time, our president at the same time is, we're basically spending barely, we're kind of hovering right around the 3% mark
Right.
ourselves.
We're
And
below
he's
it.
talking,
Yep.
and we're slightly below it. And he's talking about cutting our defense budget in half. Hegseth is preparing an 8% cut to the defense budget. If we don't get if we end up with a CR, there'll be a 1% cut across the board, which with inflation will end up being a 4% cut to the defense budget. So, I'm all in favor of making the Europeans get serious about defense, but maybe, physician, heal thyself. We should, be serious, ourselves. The second thing I would say is what you see going on now in Europe, though, unfortunately, is an example of what happens when we're not there to provide the organizing framework. So Macron has called this, emergency summit in Paris today. And the Europeans, I think, thought it would be a way to galvanize countries to do a big increase in their defense budget and have the EU do a big, investment in defense industry, which was called for by Mario Draghi in the report he did a few months ago about the state of the EU. Said we need to actually make a big investment in our own defense industry because it's in terrible shape. Meanwhile, other people are looking at other things. They're saying, well, that's not the real issue. The real issue is, as you were saying, can we provide more assistance and training to the Ukrainians if the Americans aren't there? And others, the UK, are saying we're ready to send troops as part of a EU or European. The Brits are not in the EU, of course, anymore, but some kind of European force. Although the Americans said it can't be a NATO European force because we would be obliged to defend it if it was attacked then because of Article 5. So it's going to have to be some kind of EU force. Without an American security guarantee, I don't think any of it will get off the ground, nor will it get off the ground without our, providing the command and control and the enablers, because they just can't do it themselves. Zelensky himself said, if we don't have U.S. support, he didn't say we'll have to give up, but he said it will be really hard for us to survive without U.S. support. So I'm I think a little bit more bearish than you are about where this is all heading. And then the longer term consequences, some of which you've written about yourself. One is making the world safe for premeditated aggression, which is what we would be doing, will have knock-on effects in Europe for sure. Zelensky said this, the Danish prime minister said it. If we normalize all of this and take the sanctions off, Putin will rebuild his military. He'll reconstitute it. And sometime down the road, not only will he be after Ukraine, he'll be after Moldova and maybe the Baltic states, and we will have bought ourselves, endless problems in Europe. Second, Xi Jinping is watching this, very intently. And, what that does in the Indo-Pacific, we can only speculate, but it won't be good. And then in the long, long run, in a world that really the Americans don't provide the fundamental organizing order, it's going to be Sovkeeper, and you're going to have people developing nuclear weapons. You've written about this yourself or done interviews about this yourself with European journalists, and you're quite right. That's where this is headed. And
I don't think that's the long run. I think that's the medium run. I think that would be the consequence. Like I said, I'm going to wait.
I know I'm beating you into submission.
You are beating me into submission, but I'm going to wait and see what actually happens. You were the guy, I think, in our last session, were saying, Trump is being briefed about how he's being played. He doesn't like being played, but actually, the most revealing thing you said was, the idea got into Trump's head. That's the way this guy works. He's got one day he's got one idea, the other day he's got another idea. And I am sure that somebody said, hey, we could do a great deal on Ukrainian rare earths. The same way, somebody, Jared or somebody put in his head, there's all that beachfront property in Gaza. We could do something with that. I mean, I think I had a conversation today with some very senior Europeans, very senior. They said, can you explain Trump's vision? And I said, there isn't a vision. And on top of this, you have a willful, ignorant, uh, completely transactional narcissist. In the administration, there are different people, all of whom are subservient to him, but you have some people who are kind of normal, within limits. You have some people who are Indo-Pacific people. You have some people who are hemispheric defense kinds of people. You have some people who are really on the dark side and are really kind of pro-Russian. But it is not a coherent vision. And, I think it's a big mistake to try to read coherence into a mind that is fundamentally chaotic and therefore an administration that's fundamentally chaotic. And I'll just say one other thing, if I may, and in which nobody will look the old man squarely in the eye and say, boss, that's a terrible idea for the following reasons. I mean, I think we underestimate the danger that you have when you are completely surrounded by toadies and lickspittles and cowards and opportunists.
I agree violently. So this is going to be policy by presidential whim, as it was in the first term. Only this time, there are not people to push, but there's nobody to push back this time and say, no, don't go to the May 9th, parade. If there's anything we know that Donald Trump loves, it's a big parade. And, so I think he'll be there with bells on. There was a quotation unattributed in the Financial Times from someone who is described as a former senior Russian official who'd been involved in facilitating some of these early contacts between the Putin and Trump administrations. And he said, well, this is the way Trump works. He sends out Kellogg, now he's going to send out Rubio. But in the end of the day, the only one that matters is Trump. And unfortunately, though, for him, his interlocutor is going to be Vladimir Putin, who is, and this is, verbatim, he said, who is a specialist in human relations at several levels above Trump. Translation into normal English, he's a trained KGB case officer who knows how to manipulate people. And the Russians clearly believe that they can manipulate Trump once they get him in the room. And I would put to you that, given the evidence we have from the first term, particularly the Helsinki summit, one of our guests early in this podcast, Fiona Hill, admitted to us on the air that she tried to fake a heart attack, was thinking about faking a heart attack or a health event to stop that press conference while it was going on.
No, there's no one like that. They've all sacrificed their integrity to work for this guy. I mean, you simply cannot work for this man and be a person of real integrity. I think that's. Listen, can we move on to a somewhat different thing? Like you, I'm sure. I know people who've been affected by what they've been doing directly. Like a relative who was active, who was working on PEPFAR, which is one of the greatest things we've ever done to reduce AIDS in Africa, who got summarily fired. We know senior researchers at NIH who've been basically driven out of their jobs. We know a lot of other people who were threatened by the accident. And then the other thing that, I want to pay tribute to them because, these are all good people who, took low salaries to serve the United States and who, parked their political views at the door because that's what civil servants do. And it's disgusting and shameful. But I also think it means that we should honor the people who did that and recognize them. But the other thing is, I'm sure that like you, we're both of a certain age. We both have done a lot of mentoring of younger people, either as students or just in the workplace. And I'd really like us to talk a little bit about what advice we give people, both with how to navigate the challenges if you're in government, but just how to survive this without losing your mind. And actually, I would be curious to know how you navigate this without losing your mind.
Well, first, I mean, I of course join you in offering tribute to some of these victims. One of the things that I think has been lost in all this is uh, because we've had this fire hose of stuff coming at us. This whole Elon Musk Doge effort, which is, um, I mean, in some ways it would be laughable were it not so serious. I'm sure you saw, as I did, the story that 325 employees of the National Nuclear Security Administration were fired, and then they realized, oh wait, these a lot of these people are in charge with making sure our nuclear weapons don't blow up. Maybe when they're not supposed to. Maybe we need to hire them back. Oop, whoops, we fired them. On their official email accounts and then disabled those accounts, so now we can't reach them. I mean, it would be like I've actually said to people, I feel like I'm waking up every morning in a bad episode of Veep. But there are human costs here. These are human beings whose lives are being disrupted by the richest man in the world, who has the gall to say, "Well, yeah, there's going to be some disruption, but yeah, I mean, his life's not being disrupted except by his most recent, baby mama." Um, so, um, it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, there are some really harrowing stories of folks from USAID, for instance, serving in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in which a civil war is raging, who were, on short notice, having to, front the cost of their travel home by, themselves, cut off from any communication. I mean, it's disgraceful that, any government, much less the U.S. government, would treat its employees this well.
Well, and to add to that, Musk in particular, I've only actually really just became aware of sort of the trolling of individuals.
Oh yeah.
Including there was one guy who was a blind, and so they summon up lynch mobs, and that's why I said loutish behavior. It's loud is perhaps too kind. I mean, these guys, they're bullies. I mean, they're really completely contemptible human beings, and the idea that they influence, they have this power over other people's lives it really is horrific.
Yeah. So back to your question, what advice? I think the first part, or the beginning of wisdom on this, is that when you said, how do you survive this? I think you need to start by saying you may not. You may not survive this. You may get fired. That's a reality. You need to be prepared to resign, to avoid, what you were, talking about. Someone said that they were looking at the photo op of President Trump with King Abdullah of Jordan, and Marco Rubio was sitting on, the couch in the Oval, and someone said, I think if you look at that picture long enough, you see Marco Rubio's soul leaving his body. So you want to avoid doing things that you think are wrong. And these are, some of these are Sophie's choice, right? Some of these are really tough moral choices. Think about, to me, heroism is what Danielle Sassoon did, prosecutor in New York, Southern District, New York, who refused to file a motion to drop the case against Eric Adams when Emile Beauvais, who is one of Trump's, I guess he's the number 3 in justice now, but who is Trump's personal attorney in the New York case that Alvin Bragg brought against Trump, directed them to do this in what was clearly a cynical political quid pro quo. And, the letter that one of her colleagues, before he was asked to do it, but knew it was coming, knew the request was coming, sent to Beauvais saying, I'm sure you can find some fool who will do this for
A
you,
fool or a coward?
or fool or a coward who will do this for you, but it won't be me. And so I think everybody, has to have like a letter of resignation in their pocket ready to go, because you may be put in positions where you're going to have to do it. Now, at the end of the day, what Beauvais did, which was, again, indicative of, I think, the sort of mafia-like mentality of this administration. He called in a bunch of prosecutors and said it was collective punishment. He said, unless someone steps forward to send this motion to New York, I'm going to fire you all.
Yeah. Well, then
And
you accept that.
yeah. Well, one of the guys, said, okay, I'm going to try and protect these other younger prosecutors, and agreed to do it. I mean, look, I'm not going to judge that person because I wasn't in the room. I don't know how it went down, but these are the kinds of choices people are going to have to make, and they need to be prepared, and they need to prepare to exit. There was a terrific book, Exit, Loyalty, or Voice,
Yeah.
about people in dealing with government. I read that before I became a Foreign Service officer, and I actually discussed it in my oral exam.
Albert Hirschman.
I was asked, what how would you deal with policies that you don't agree with, because you have to do that in the Foreign Service. And I basically said, well, there are three choices. There's exit, loyalty, or voice. My own view would be give voice to your best professional judgment, and then if the policy is one you disagree with but you can live with, then you owe them loyalty. You have to carry out the instructions. That's what a disciplined, diplomatic service does. And if it's a policy that you can't support, then you resign, then you exit. And the problem now, though, is they've done this new executive order for the Foreign Service that basically says if you're not loyal and you're not carrying out the president's policy, and even if there are any indications you might have qualms about the president's policy, that's grounds for removal by the Secretary of State. What that's done is basically chilled any inclination that anyone in the Foreign Service is going to have to give voice to their views before they give their loyalty, which is going to be very bad for this administration, because they're going to be proposing things, and somebody in the room is going to be able to say, before you do that, you might want to think about the second, third, and fourth order consequences of that. Those people now are going to be silent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that goes to the earlier point that they are setting themselves up for some catastrophes. I mean, in so many ways. For example, they're firing members of the Epidemic Intelligence Service. So these very brave, brilliant scientists who go around when Ebola breaks out somewhere to figure out what's going on. I agree. Not that I ever expected a problem, and I didn't have one, but when I went into government, I did write a letter of resignation and just signed it, but didn't date it. I do think I completely agree with the way you put it. I think the one thing though that I would add is, in some of the really tough situations like the one you're talking about, you've got to be prepared to accept that it may not be a clear-cut case where they say go strangle that baby in that crib, and you say I can't strangle that baby in that crib. There's always going to be, when your integrity is put on the line, there's always a somewhat arbitrary part to it, and that's why I've always recommended to people that they go see A Man for All Seasons. This wonderful old movie with Paul Scofield as an idealized Sir Thomas More. The real Thomas More tortured heretics in his basement, but Paul Scofield is the Thomas More that we wish there was, who famously ends up on the block because he will not endorse the Henry VIII's divorce. And he has a wonderful line where his daughter, who he was very close to, and who was quite a brilliant woman, is pleading with him to take the oath, and he understands why. That you need a male heir and all that. And he says when a man takes an oath, he holds himself in his hands like water, and if he ever opens his fingers, he can never hope to find himself again. And many men can do that. Meg, I hope your father's not one of them. And I think, it captures something that if once you go over a certain line, you're not going to find yourself again. I mean, that's why what you just said about Rubio's soul leaving him. I think of some of the people we know. These are damaged souls. These are no longer intact human beings at a certain level. I was talking to somebody today who knew one of the senior responsible people in the first term, and they had just seen this person. And they said, he's still not over it. He's still wrestling with what he did and what he had to go along with. And he'll never be whole again.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, the other thing I would tell people in terms of advice is that a common mentor of ours, Al Bernstein, the late Al Bernstein, taught both of us, I believe, that the thing that separates mankind from the lower biological orders is, as far as we know, only mankind, only men and women are capable of deceiving themselves. And, when you're faced with these choices, as you were just saying, there's a very easy out. And the easy out is, if I don't do this, someone worse will take my place.
Right. That's the Vichy excuse. I better go work for the Vichy government, because then otherwise the really hard types will take over.
Right. And that is, that way lies the road to perdition. Because as you say, this is where, this one's not so bad. I can maybe live with this. But then eventually, after how many times do you end up, completely consumed by the many compromises you've made? And in fact, part of, I think, Trump's MO is to make people assert, this is what Hannah Arendt called the annihilation of truth.
Yeah.
Sort of make people say the most ridiculous things you can imagine on your behalf, because then you own them,
right,
forever. So make everybody say it's the Gulf of America.
I was just about to say the Gulf of America, which is the stupidest damn thing ever.
We've got a member of Congress now who has entered a bill, Claudia Tenney, a Republican from New York, who's entered a bill to make Donald Trump's birthday on, I think it's June 14th, a national holiday. It's Flag Day. Trump and President Trump's birthday and Flag Day. So we've had another member who's introduced a bill to a constitutional amendment to allow the president to run for yet another term. Now, he may not even need that, because he may find another way around it. But this is the kind of stuff that's going on now, and people have to just understand that you don't go there. There be dragons.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think we should also, what I've also had, and I'm sure you've had too, is people who are very distraught, but who are not being personally affected by this. So they're not in government or about to feel although we'll all feel the indirect repercussions of the wrecking.
Oh, absolutely.
This, whether it's the outbreak of measles in Texas, by the way, and all kinds of things. So my advice there, this may be different from yours. So just like to friends and former students, what have you, how do I live with this? My first piece of advice is, don't let them live rent free in your head.
Yes, I agree.
Don't spend every day obsessing about this. Understand there are things that are more important than politics. Understand that the wheel of fortune changes. You have no idea what's going to happen. Accept that. Secondly, find meaning and activity and purpose in lots of other things that don't have to do with politics. If there's an area where you can do some good, do it. But otherwise, do something else. And then I think the third thing is, remember to laugh at them. That's important too. When you can laugh at somebody, first they hate it. I think Trump really hates it when people laugh at him. That's typical authoritarian personality. But it means that you're seeing them in their true proportion for the kind of ridiculous figures that they are. Dangerous, ridiculous figures. I once talked to Azar Nafisi. I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you. It was wonderful student of Persian literature, wrote a fascinating book called Reading Lolita in Tehran. She was then a student activist and became a dissident. And I asked her what was her favorite novel. She's a literature professor. We were talking about. So she loves Nabokov. She said her favorite one is Invitation to an Execution, which, as it happens, I just read, and in which part of the, it's this sort of Nabokov surreal stuff in which the kind of judges are literally clowns and they behave clownishly. And she said, it was a perfect description of Iran. I said, what? She said, yeah, that's what you have to understand about these people. They're clowns. They're jokers. They're ridiculous. Now, they can kill you, but it's important to remember that that's what they really are. And that is what they are.
Yeah. I agree with you. Just going back to those who are actually kind of in the line of fire and have to deal with this. I guess the adjunct to what I was saying about, don't deceive yourself is that where do you draw the line? It goes to your point. And how do you know where the line is? And that's a difficult thing. And I think it comes out in that, Daniel Sassoon and what the folks at Southern District New York did. You can't let them make you lie. This is, Václav Havel's Living in Truth. This is what they're seeking to do, is to obliterate truth. And your job is to, maintain the truth as you see it.
Well, there's that wonderful Solzhenitsyn line, which from his Nobel laureate speech, which I quoted in a different article, which says, let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. And I think that's a creed to live by. And look, this is bad. It's not as bad as being in Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany, and it's not going to be that way. There'll be bad things. I literally, people will die as a result of this. We will come through at the other end. I mean, we'll be badly battered. Some things may end up turning out for the better in ways that we can't really foretell. So, you got to, I think it's also important to retain a certain kind of optimism. I mean, if you read any of the camp literature, concentration camp literature, the people who lost any kind of hope were some of the first ones to go. And so simply as a matter of self-preservation, but also because, I think there are reasonable grounds for it. Don't give up hope.
This is a really unusually upbeat note on which to end an episode of Shield of the Republic. I'm not sure we can do this again, but at any rate, Eliot, thank you for joining me. I look forward to hopefully seeing you next week. And thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in to Shield of the Republic.
And thanks to, again, just a final word of thanks to all those civil servants who are in the path of something you don't deserve and who signed up to serve our country. We appreciate you.